They were seen as wild horsemen, uncivilized, forgotten. But in less than a generation, they built the largest land empire in human history. What did the world miss, and what secrets still lie beneath the hooves of Mongol horses? Chapter 1. The steppe awakens. Imagine a place where winter bites deep, where the wind howls across a frozen plain with no trees to stop it. A place where life is hard, and the land is harsher. This was the Mongolian steppe. Vast, cold, and unforgiving. Families, tribes, small groups who had learned to survive where few others could. They lived in round felt tents called yurt. They rode horses not as luxury, but as life. Their children learned to ride before they could walk steadily. Feuds passed from father to son. One tribe raided another's horses, another kidnapped someone's wife. Retaliation followed. Violence was common. And yet, in the middle of all this chaos, something was stirring. Slowly, quietly, a kind of energy, building like a storm behind the hills. They didn't build cities or write books, but they knew the land. They knew the stars, and they knew how to endure. To outsiders, it seemed empty, but it wasn't. Scattered across these wild plains were people. Power wasn't passed down by bloodlines in golden halls. It was earned on horseback. You needed to know who would ride beside you in battle, and who might betray you the moment your back was turned. And in a world so uncertain, people learned to move fast, think fast, and live with caution. They also learned to fight not just with strength, but with strategy. A leader had to be strong, yes, but also clever, brave, loyal to his allies, ruthless to his enemies. If he lost a battle, people left him. If he won, they followed, because it shaped him, and through him, it would shape the world. At the start of the 12th century, no one paid much attention to the steppe. In places like Baghdad, Constantinople, or Beijing, the people of the steppe were seen as little more than horse-riding raiders, barbarians, nomads, tribes, who fought each other for scraps. To the west, the Islamic world stretched from Persia to North Africa, nothing more. To the south and east, China's great dynasties built walls and palaces. You learned to track, pray, read the wind, fix your saddle in the dark. You learned to fight with a bow from a galloping horse. You didn't fear the cold, you used it. In India, temples and cities fell. Europe was growing too, slowly, unevenly, with its own struggles and wars. And for one boy, born into a time of betrayal and violence, the land would teach him everything. Summer was for moving, hunting, gathering. Winter was for sheltering, storytelling, mending gear. They didn't even have a word for it. What they wanted at first was peace, stability, an end to the endless tribal feuds. Families passed down songs, legends, and wisdom around the fire. They told tales of great ancestors, of thunder spirits in the sky and wolves who walked with men. In the next chapter, we meet the boy who would become Genghis Khan. And truthfully, they did fight, constantly. They were learning speed, flexibility, and adaptation. Nearly starved, and still, he rose. Not just for the Mongols, but for the entire world. They were building systems of trust across clans. They were watching their enemies, learning from them, testing themselves. And they had something else, something that history often underestimates. They had unity waiting to be found. All it needed was the right person to unlock it. Each tribe had its own leader, its own pride. The Mongols were just one of many tribes on the steppe. They weren't the strongest, they weren't the richest, but they were tough. That person was still a child, a boy named Temujin. But before we get to him, we need to understand the world he was born into. The rules of the steppe life on the steppe followed its own logic. There were no castles, no kings. It was a world where trust could mean life or death. Everything was temporary. Food, shelter, safety, even friendship. And yet, despite the violence, there was a strange sense of balance. The steppe had its own rhythm. Even in the wildest times, there was tradition, there was honor, and there was potential. The silence before the storm at this time. Powerful kingdoms surrounded the steppe. All of these civilizations saw themselves as the center of the world. The Mongolian steppe, that was just the background noise, a place for wild horsemen and unpredictable raids. But they were wrong, because while the cities built upward, the steppe was building outward. The people there were learning more than just survival, and the land itself was training them. In Mongolia, you didn't survive by hiding behind walls, you survived by moving with the seasons. It was a place that rewarded sharp minds and strong spirits, a place where weakness was not allowed to last, a whisper of what's to come. The people of the steppe had no plans to build an empire. They wanted security for their herds, their families, their lives. But peace would not come easily. And then, one boy lost his father, was cast out Temujin, over and over, because this child, born into a tent on the cold steppe, would grow up to change everything. But that's a story for the next chapter. If you're still here, thank you for joining this quiet journey through the windswept plains of history. If this story helped you slow down and reflect, consider liking the video, subscribing for more episodes, and letting us know your thoughts in the comments. Your curiosity keeps history alive. Chapter 2. The child named Temujin, the boy who would change the world, was not born in a palace. He was not the son of a king. He was born in a tent, under an open sky, with nothing but the wind and wolves to witness his arrival. The year was around 1162. His father, Yasuge, was a tribal chief, not powerful, but respected. He had built alliances through marriage and warfare. For a short time, his family had some stability, but on the steppe, stability never lasted long. From the very beginning, Temujin's life would be tested. A childhood cut short, Temujin's early years were not easy, but they were still years of family. His mother Holen, his siblings, and the small band that followed Yasuge. But when Temujin was about 9, everything changed. His father was poisoned. It happened quietly, without warning. While visiting another tribe, Yasuge was offered food, a gesture of peace, but the food had been laced with poison. He died not long after, and just like that, Temujin's world fell apart. His tribe, once loyal to his father, abandoned the family. Why follow a widow and her young children when there were stronger men to lead? In the world of the steppe, power was everything. Without it, you were nothing. Temujin, his mother, and his siblings were left with nothing. No animals, no allies, no protection. They had to survive on scraps, roots, and wild berries. She reminded him who his father was and who he might become. The family hunted rats and small animals just to stay alive. Winter after winter, they endured. The strength of Holen, Temujin's mother, Holen, deserves a place in every history book. Temujin saw this as a threat, not just to himself, but to the safety of the whole group. She was not a warrior. She didn't ride into battle, but her strength kept her children alive when the world turned against them. She taught Temujin discipline. She told him stories of honor, of loyalty, of survival. Her influence shaped Temujin's sense of justice, of right and wrong, of when to show mercy and when to strike. And above all, she taught him never to give up. A family divided even within the family. There were tensions. They didn't kill him, but they humiliated him. They locked a wooden board around his neck to keep him from escaping. They treated him like a slave. Temujin and his older half-brother, Begta, often clashed. Begta tried to assert control, demanding more food, more respect. One day, Temujin and his younger brother Kasar made a decision. They killed Begta. It was not a moment of cruelty. It was a moment of survival, but it would mark Temujin forever. He learned that leadership required hard choices, that in a harsh world, hesitation could be fatal. They were bonded by custom, under a sacred oath of brotherhood. Captured and chained, Temujin's teenage years were no easier. Small groups, outcasts, families with no one to protect them. Temujin offered them something different, not just safety, but fairness. He was captured by a rival tribe, the Taishiad, who saw him as a threat. But Temujin didn't break. Bert would become not just his wife, but his closest advisor. She saw in him what others didn't yet, the spark of leadership, the weight of destiny. He gathered a small force, rode into danger, and brought her back. He watched, he listened, and one night, with help from a kind guard, he escaped into the darkness. People saw his courage, they saw his resolve. They followed because they believed. It was a small act, but it was the beginning of something greater. Temujin was learning that survival wasn't enough. He wanted to rise, a loyal bond. He believed in what could be. Not long after escaping, Temujin made a choice that would change his path. He returned to a childhood friend named Jam. They had grown up together, playing as boys, training with bows and horses. Together, they began to gather allies. He promoted men based on loyalty and skill, not blood. He punished betrayal, but rewarded courage. People who had nothing began to follow him. His reputation grew. Love and loss somewhere along this path. Temujin married Bert, a strong and wise woman from another tribe. Their bond was real, but that destiny was tested again. Wari would face betrayal, defeat, and despair again. But the boy who once starved in the snow was no longer weak, and even the loss of his oldest friendships. One night, Bert was kidnapped by a rival tribe. Temujin didn't hesitate. It wasn't just about love. It was about honor. It was about not letting fear rule your actions. Temujin was becoming a leader, not by title, but by choice. A dream bigger than survival. Temujin began to ask a dangerous question. What if the steppe could be united? No one had ever done it before. The tribes hated each other. Blood feuds went back generations. But Temujin didn't believe in the past. He offered a new kind of order, a world where your worth came from loyalty, not lineage, where strength was earned, not inherited, where justice replaced chaos. He didn't want to rule like the old chiefs, drunk on tradition and pride. He wanted to build something stronger, but that would require betrayal. The storm is coming. Temujin's rise was not smooth. He would clash with his blood brother Jammu. He was learning to lead. He was learning to conquer. He was learning to survive not just for himself, but for a vision bigger than any tribe. The steppe was waking, and Temujin was its voice. In the next chapter, we'll follow Temujin's rise as he begins to unite the Mongol tribes, not through birthright, but through bold action. If this chapter helped you understand the roots of a legend, consider liking the video, subscribing for more, and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Your voice keeps this history alive. Chapter 3. Uniting the Wolves. Temujin had survived. He had escaped slavery. He had rescued his wife. He had gathered a small following. But to truly change the steppe, survival was not enough. He needed to do the impossible. Unite the tribes of the steppe. For centuries, the steppe had been a land of division. Some were proud and powerful. Others were fading, weakened by years of war and hunger. Dozens of tribes, large and small, each ruled by their own chiefs. But they all had one thing in common. They did not trust each other. If someone's grandfather killed your uncle, you might still seek revenge to generations later. Old feuds, blood, debts, betrayal. These were the things that tied the tribes together, not friendship. The idea of uniting these tribes wasn't just difficult, it was dangerous. But Temujin saw something others didn't. He saw that the only future for the Mongol people was together, not as enemies, but as one force. New rules for a new order. To bring people together, Temujin had to offer them something better, not just promises, real change. And so, he began to break old customs. Traditionally, Mongol leaders gave power to their relatives or to friends from the same tribe. Temujin refused to do that. If you were brave, if you were loyal, you could rise. It didn't matter who your father was. He promoted based on loyalty and talent, no matter a man's bloodline. This was revolutionary. Imagine a world where you had been ignored your whole life because of your birth, and suddenly, someone told you, you matter, you can lead. But their visions for the future were different. People listened, people followed, brothers become enemies. But not everyone liked this change. Temujin's childhood blood brother, Jamukha, had also become a leader. For a while, They worked together. Jamuka believed in the old ways, Paya for the noble families, strength through tradition. Temujin believed in a future of merit and unity. The steppe could not follow two leaders. They lost, many were captured, and so the wolves turned on each other. But he would never forget what Jamuka had done, and neither would his followers. The first civil war in 1187, the two men faced off in battle. Temujin's army was smaller, made up of lower-born warriors, common people, outcasts. Jamuka's force was larger and backed by noble families. At first, Temujin's side fought bravely, but they were outnumbered. Jamuka ordered a brutal punishment. He boiled 70 of Temujin's commanders alive. It was a message. Do not challenge the old order. Temujin escaped. The turning point, he created a new system, structured, clear, and fair. Temujin could have given up. He had failed. He had lost friends, but instead, he did something few leaders could. He listened. He asked his followers why they stayed, what they needed, what they feared, and then he adjusted. He began to formalize his leadership. Farmers, herders, craftsmen, warriors from different tribes, different regions. He organized his growing army into units of 10, 100, 1,000. This was no longer a tribe. It was a machine, a gathering of clans. As word spread of Temujin's leadership, more people joined. He gave them protection, justice, purpose, and in return, they gave him something no Mongol leader had ever truly held: unity. In 1201, the tribes gathered to choose a Khagan, a universal leader of all Mongols. Jamuka tried again. He was chosen by some nobles, but his support was fading. They used tactics, false retreats, ambushes, fast-moving horse archers. People were tired of noble pride, tired of tribal chaos. They wanted something new. He knew the old ways were ending. He accepted death. Temujin was not yet, but the wind was changing. Victory at Khalkha in 1204. Temujin and Jamuka faced each other again. This time, Temujin's army was stronger, smarter, and more organized. Jamuka's side collapsed. Temujin could have killed him, but he offered peace, mercy. Jamuka refused. Temujin had defeated his greatest rival. Now, nothing stood between him and the dream of a united steppe. The birth of Genghis Khan in 1206. All the major Mongol tribes gathered at the Anun River. There, under the wide sky, Temujin was given a new title: Genghis Khan, universal ruler. It was more than a name. It was a symbol of a new world. A world where tribe didn't matter, where talent ruled over blood, where one man's vision could bind thousands into one purpose. The wolves were no longer fighting each other. Now, they were running together. What came next with the tribes united? Genghis Khan now had something the world had never seen before: a disciplined, loyal, mobile empire on horseback. But his eyes were not on the steppe anymore. They were turning outward, toward the great civilizations that had once ignored or mocked his people. To the east, the powerful Jin dynasty of China. To the west, the wealthy cities of Central Asia. Beyond them, empires that believed they were safe, behind walls and pride. They were wrong. The empire of the steppe had awakened. In the next chapter, we'll explore how Genghis Khan used brilliant military strategies to begin his conquest of the world. If this story opened your eyes to a part of history rarely told, consider liking, subscribing, and sharing your thoughts below. Let's keep learning together, one quiet chapter at a time. Chapter 4. The Art of Mongol War. Genghis Khan now led the united tribes. The steppe was his, but uniting a people was only the beginning. Now, it was time to use it. He had built an army, not just any army, but one the world had never seen before. Not for revenge, not for chaos, but for conquest. Fast, silent, deadly. The Mongol army was unlike any other. They did not march slowly. They did not rely on roads. They did not wait for spring. Mongol warriors rode with the wind. They traveled light, carrying dried meat, milk, and small tents. Each soldier had multiple horses and changed between them to avoid exhaustion. This gave them speed, pure, unmatched speed. They could cover hundreds of miles in days. By the time an enemy heard they were coming, it was already too late. And when they arrived, they hit hard. Discipline over bravery. Many armies of the time admired personal courage. A hero might charge forward, sword in hand, to prove his worth, harshly. But fairness was also key. Loot was shared by system. Rewards came to those who followed rules. But Genghis Khan did not reward reckless bravery. He rewarded discipline. His soldiers moved in units. They followed strict orders. They trained to fight as one. Each man knew his place, when to charge, when to retreat, when to flank. Disobedience was punished. This created something rare in war: trust, the power of the bow. The Mongol bow was small but strong, made from horn, wood, and sinew. It could fire arrows over 300 yards. From horseback, Mongol archers could shoot in any direction, even backward while riding away. This allowed for one of their most feared tactics: the false retreat. They would pretend to flee. The enemy, thinking victory was near, would chase. Then the Mongols would turn, surround them, and destroy them. It worked again and again. If one city resisted and was destroyed, 10 others might surrender without a fight. They learned the layout of towns, the strength of defenses, and the moods of rulers. Their enemies never seemed to learn. Intelligence and spies. Genghis Khan knew that information was as powerful as arrows. Before any battle, he gathered intelligence. Scouts mapped the land. Spies moved into cities and markets. Later, they did the same in Persia and the Middle East. With help from local experts, they spread fear. They whispered stories of Mongol cruelty. Sometimes, this alone caused cities to surrender, and when cities did resist, they often paid a terrible price. This was not just brutality, it was strategy. Genghis Khan believed fear was a weapon that saved time, that saved lives, Mongol lives. The enemy's strength becomes yours. The Mongols did not just kill their enemies, they studied them. If a city had skilled workers, engineers, or doctors, they were spared and brought into the empire. If a nation used siege weapons, the Mongols learned how to build them. When they attacked China's Jin dynasty, they used Chinese engineers to breach walls. This made their army smarter. With each conquest, they improved. Every defeat taught them something. No borders, no rest. Turks, Chinese, Persians, even former enemies joined his ranks. Other armies fought for seasons. When the cold came, they went home. Not the Mongols. They fought in snow, desert, mountains, and jungle. Their horses were tough. Their bodies adapted. The idea of stopping did not exist. They moved like nature, always forward. This shocked their enemies. Borders meant nothing. Distance meant nothing. And as their reputation grew, fear spread faster than their horses. Loyalty, not blood. The Mongol army was not just made of Mongols. Genghis Khan welcomed outsiders. As long as they were loyal, they were treated with respect. This added new skills to the army, new languages, technologies, and ideas. It was not just a force of destruction. It became a living, learning machine, one that grew smarter, faster, and more dangerous with every campaign. War was only a tool, no golden throne. He ruled from horseback, sharing hardships with his men. To Genghis Khan, war was not the goal, it was the tool. He believed in a world of order, a world where trade moved freely, where roads were safe, where laws were clear. But to build that world, the old powers had to fall. Corrupt kings, greedy lords, proud empires, they stood in the way. So he sent his armies forward, not to destroy everything, but to remove the obstacles. Once conquered, many lands were treated well. Taxes were fair, religions were allowed, merchants were protected. As long as they obeyed, peace followed. But if they resisted, the storm returned. A new kind of conqueror. Many rulers took lands and ruled with fear. Genghis Khan used fear, yes, but he also used vision. He had no castles. He remembered hunger. He remembered betrayal. that made him different. He didn't want to be worshipped. He wanted to build something that would last, a world that worked better than the one he had inherited. And for a time, he succeeded. The next targets by 1215, Genghis Khan had taken the northern part of China. Cities like Beijing fell after long sieges. His forces turned west, towards Central Asia. Great trading cities like Bukhara and Samarkand stood in his path. They believed they were safe, walled, rich, proud. They were wrong. The Mongol army was coming, and it would not stop. In the next chapter, we'll follow the Mongol march into Central Asia, where silk met steel, and entire cities vanished overnight. If this journey through forgotten history is helping you see the past in a new light, leave a comment, like the video, and subscribe for more deep dives like this. Chapter 5. Lessons in Surrender. When the Mongols arrived, most cities didn't stand a chance, not because their walls were weak or their armies small, but because their leaders didn't understand what they were facing. The Mongol army was like a tide that didn't crash against the gates. It rose quietly, circled like mist, and then swallowed entire cities. But there was one thing that could stop it: surrender. It sounds simple, but in the 13th century, surrender wasn't just laying down arms. It was a question of survival, pride, and legacy. And for many rulers, it was the hardest lesson to learn. To some, it sounded like mercy. To others, humiliation. But the Mongols weren't bluffing. The Mongols offered a clear choice: submit peacefully, pay tribute, and keep your life in status, or resist and face destruction. In the city of Nishapur in Persia, the governor chose to fight. His army fell. The city was destroyed. Tens of thousands were killed. The Mongols didn't just want victory, they wanted to send a message. Resistance was not brave, it was foolish. Yet some cities listened, and in return, the city was spared mass destruction. They believed the world was meant to be united under one ruler, and resistance, in their eyes, was defiance of fate itself. In Persia, tax collectors and administrators were left in place so the empire could function without chaos. Surrender, in this sense, meant more than survival. It meant collaboration. Yes, the Mongols still took what they needed, but the people lived. Trade resumed. Life, somehow, went on. In Central Asia, the wealthy trading city of Bukhara decided to open its gates. Its leaders welcomed Genghis Khan with gifts and submission. Genghis Khan reportedly stood in Bukhara's Grand Mosque and told the people it wasn't only about cities, it was about knowledge, cultures, and systems. Baghdad, the heart of the Islamic world, was a city of scholars, poets, and immense wealth. When the Mongols arrived in 1258, the Caliph believed God would protect him. He refused to surrender. The Mongols didn't destroy everything. They were curious, practical. If a culture had something useful, a technology, a belief system, a skilled class of workers, they kept it. The Tigris River ran black with ink from ruined Librazar and red with blood. It was the end of an era. The fall of Baghdad showed the world what happened when pride stood in the way of practicality. I am the punishment of God. If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me. It wasn't just arrogance, it was a belief system. The Mongols saw their conquests as part of a divine order. They believed in order under their rule. Cities that surrendered were often turned into centers of administration and trade. Postal stations, called yam, were built across the empire, enabling messages to travel hundreds of miles in days. Roads were protected, merchants were taxed fairly, but there were layers to this idea of surrender. In China, engineers who knew how to build siege weapons were spared and absorbed into the Mongol army. The Mongol Empire didn't just grow by fear, it grew by adopting what worked. It was about knowing when to yield. Changed, yes, but not erased. Your voice matters. And time after time, those who refused to surrender believed they could be the exception. And for those who did surrender early, their cities often became wealthier under Mongol rule than they had been before. Still, not all surrenders were peaceful. Some were desperate. The The Mongols laid siege, and yet, even in all this destruction, the Mongols didn't seek chaos. Peace, under Mongol terms, was real, but it came at a cost. As the empire expanded, surrender became not just a choice, it became a culture, a way of thinking. To resist the Mongols wasn't noble, it was suicidal. You had to let go of independence. Many leaders wrestled with this idea. Was surrender weakness or wisdom? In hindsight, the Mongol offer was brutally logical. Resist and lose everything. Submit and keep a version of your world. This was the paradox of Mongol power. They destroyed to create. They demanded obedience, but offered protection. They crushed kings, but respected ideas. None were. The real lesson: survival wasn't about strength, and in the Mongol world, those who yielded lived to tell the tale. Ready for chapter 6? Let me know if you'd like to continue with the next part of the story. And if this history speaks to you, consider liking the video, subscribing for more stories like this, and leaving a comment. Chapter 6. A world rewired. The Mongols didn't just conquer land, they rewired how the world moved. Before them, the continents were distant neighbors, each with their own rhythms, beliefs, and borders. After the Mongols, those borders started to blur, not by diplomacy, but by force. It was connection. What followed wasn't just empire. From the yellow plains of China to the forests of Eastern Europe, they connected cities that had never even heard of each other. At the height of their power, the Mongols ruled over the largest contiguous land empire in human history. But it wasn't only about land, it was about roads, systems, and speed. For comparison, Europe wouldn't see such efficiency for centuries. The Mongols built an empire that could breathe. Orders arrived on time. Silk from China, spices from India, glassware from Persia, furs from Russia. They all began moving across the empire like blood in a beating heart. Trade became smoother. And with trade came ideas. Paper money, once a local Chinese experiment, started appearing across Mongol lands. They developed a vast courier network called the Yam. It wasn't just a line of messengers, it was a web. Relay stations every 25 to 30 miles. Fresh horses, food, but so did something else. Shelter, security. A message could travel thousands of miles across Central Asia in just a few days. It changed everything. Armies moved faster. In many ways, this policy created one of the most religiously diverse empires in history, and they reshaped how humans thought about geography, about speed, about what was possible. Knowledge. Doctors in Baghdad were suddenly reading medical texts from China. Astronomers in Central Asia were learning from Persian scholars. The world was being stitched together, not gently, but permanently. But for a moment in time, they held the threads of the world in their hands. Of course, this wasn't a utopia. The lines between Mongol and local began to blur, and while that made governance smoother, it also weakened the Mongol identity over generations. These connections were forged through fear and violence, but once forged, they stayed. In Persia, Mongol rulers adopted local customs, wore Persian robes, spoke the language, and commissioned Islamic architecture. In China, Kublai Khan took on Chinese court rituals, styled himself as a proper emperor, and ruled not as a conqueror but as a son of heaven. Trade routes that had once taken years to open could now be used safely by anyone who paid Mongol tax. New languages, new ways of writing history. Europe changed. Even European merchants like the famous Marco Polo walked those roads and wrote of cities filled with lights, order, and astonishing goods. His stories weren't fantasy. Mathematics, astronomy, medicine all entered Europe through Mongol lands, and it helped spark a new hunger for knowledge. They were glimpses into a world the Mongols had built. The Black Death, one of the deadliest plagues in history, traveled those same Mongol trade routes. Whether true or not, the fact remains. Their connected world came with a terrible cost. From Central Asia to the Middle East, then to Europe, millions died. Some historians even argue that, without the Mongol link, the Renaissance might have come centuries later. or not at all. But the connections weren't only physical, they were political. The Mongols practiced a strange kind of tolerance. You could be Muslim, Christian, Buddhist, it didn't matter, as long as you obeyed the Khan and paid tribute. And the Mongols had built it, strand by strand. In cities like Samarkand and Karakoram, mosques stood beside temples. Priests debated with him. Ideas flowed across faiths, not always peacefully but more freely than in many other parts of the world at the time. And with that flow came something unintended, resistance. As people shared knowledge and saw the bigger picture, they also began to ask questions about power, about justice, about identity. The Mongols had connected the world, but they also exposed themselves to its complexity. Their empire wasn't built to last forever. No empire is. One of the most surprising legacies of this era was cultural fusion. Still, it created something beautiful, new forms of art. The empire didn't just destroy it, and then, something even more unexpected happened. The Mongol connection to the east brought back more than silk and spices. It brought back ideas. The ripples of their rule reached far beyond their borders. But the same roads that carried wealth and wisdom also carried death. Some say the Mongols launched the first instance of biological warfare, catapulting plague, infected corpses over city walls. Still, even that dark chapter proved how deeply they had rewired the planet. By the late 13th century, the Mongol Empire was no longer just a force of destruction. It was a machine of movement. Ideas, goods, people, everything flowed. For the first time, the world felt like one system, one giant web. Chapter 7. The Silk Road reborn before the Mongols. The Silk Road was a legend, a trail of trade, winding from China to the Mediterranean, carrying silk, spices, gold, and stories. But for centuries, it had also been dangerous. Bandits, broken roads, and warring kingdoms made the journey costly and often deadly. Then came Genghis Khan, and the road breathed again. The Mongols didn't just conquer cities, they connected them. Under their rule, from the 13th to the 14th century, the Silk Road became safer, faster, and more reliable than it had been for 1,000 years. It was one of the most unexpected results of their brutal rise to power. They burned empires to the ground, then built corridors of peace on the ashes. It began with a simple rule: you kill a merchant on the road, you die. No matter who you were, noble, soldier, even Mongol trade was protected at all costs. Why? Because the Mongols understood something many didn't. War brings wealth for a time, but trade builds an empire that lasts. Across their vast territory, the Mongols created an infrastructure unlike anything the world had seen. Relay stations called yam dotted the roads every few dozen miles. At each post, fresh horses, rest, food, and security. Messengers and traders alike could travel thousands of miles with speed and relative safety. They used passports, basically small metal tablets, stamped with the Great Khan seal. If you carried one, you were under his protection. Harming the bearer of a paisi was a crime against the Khan himself. It was the birth of international travel documents. With the roads secure, trade exploded. From the east came silk, porcelain, tea, and gunpowder. From the west came glass, wool, wine, and silver. In the middle flowed everything else: ideas, inventions, religions, diseases, people. The Silk Road under Mongol rule was not just about goods, it was a global highway of thought. Muslim doctors in Persia began studying Chinese herbal medicine. Chinese astronomers learned from Islamic scholars who traced the stars across desert skies. Engineers, philosophers, craftsmen, they all crossed paths, and sometimes these meetings changed history. Compass technology moved west. Arabic numerals moved east. Paper money was introduced in new regions. Even military strategy evolved as generals borrowed tactics across borders. The most famous traveler of this age was Marco Polo. The Venetian merchant reached China in the late 1200s and spent over a decade in the Mongol court, serving under Kublai Khan. When he returned home, people doubted his stories. Paper money, endless palaces, a mail system that worked, cities with heated roads. It sounded like fantasy, but he wasn't lying. He had seen the Silk Road reborn with his own eyes. And yet, the open roads came with a shadow. The same safety and speed that allowed ideas and goods to move also allowed death to travel faster. Around 1330, something stirred in Central Asia. The plague, Yersinia pest, spread by trade, hidden in the fur of rats, carried in cargo, carried by fleas. Within a decade, it had reached Europe. Within two, it had killed nearly 1/3 of its population. The Black Death was the dark twin of the Silk Road's golden promise, and it would never have moved so fast, so far without the Mongol roads. But the Mongols did not intend this. To them, trade was a path to unity. In fact, Genghis Khan and his descendants encouraged multinational cooperation long before the concept had a name. They brought in Persian administrators, Chinese engineers, Armenian merchants, Russian craftsmen. They allowed Christian, Muslim, and Buddhist leaders to speak in their courts. In their own harsh way, they created a world that felt for a brief time borderless. Cities like Samarkand, Tabriz, and Hangzhou became centers of multicultural life. Markets buzzed in dozens of languages. Food, clothing, books, and technology mixed in ways that had never been possible before. The Mongol Empire wasn't just a war machine, it was the operating system for a new kind of world, and at its core was the road. But like all roads, the Silk Road under Mongol rule was vulnerable. After the death of the last strong Khans, the empire began to break apart. Khanates grew distant, roads grew less safe, cooperation turned to rivalry. By the late 14th century, the Silk Road was fading again, not dead, but slower, thinner, fractured. New powers rose, and old fears returned. But the memory of that great network of a world linked by one will. In time, European explorers like Columbus would set sail not just for spices or gold, but to rebuild that lost connection. Because once people tasted a united world, they would never stop chasing it. And the first empire to make it real was the Mongols. Chapter 8. After Genghis, when Genghis Khan died in 1227, he left behind the largest land empire the world had ever seen. But he also left behind a question. What happens after the conqueror is gone? The answer would shape the fate of continents. Before his death, Genghis had set a plan in motion. His empire would be split among his sons not as rivals, but as stewards of one grand vision. The land was divided into khanates, each ruled by a branch of his family. To the west, his son Genghis Khan controlled the steppes and forests of what is now Russia and Eastern Europe. This would become the Golden Horde. To the east, his son Gedai inherited the Mongol heartland and much of China's frontier. To the south, Chagatai ruled Central Asia, from the mountains of modern Kazakhstan to the edges of Persia. Each Khanate had autonomy, but all were meant to answer to the great Khan, the supreme leader of the empire. That was the idea. Reality would prove more complicated. Gedai, Genghis's third son, was chosen as Great Khan. And for a while, it worked. Gedai was not a warrior like his father, but he was a builder, a thinker, a drinker, to famously, but more on that later. Under his rule, the Mongol Empire expanded even further. He conquered northern China and launched attacks into Korea, Persia, and Europe. He built cities, roads, and administrative systems to keep the empire connected. He also began constructing Karakoram, the Mongol capital place, with Persian architects, Chinese artisans, and traders from across the known world. It was a capital not of one nation, but of many. Then Gedai died, and the gears began to grind. Succession became a battlefield. Who would be next? Gedai's son, one of Genghis's other grandsons. For a decade, the empire hesitated. Campaigns into Europe were paused. Tensions rose between the and into that silence stepped a new figure. Genghis Khan, the grandson of Genghis, was strict, focused, and ruthless. He wanted to restore unity. He forced obedience from the Western. He sent his brother Hulagu to conquer the Middle East. He sent his other brother Kublai to push deeper into China. For a brief moment, the empire moved like one body again, but Mangi died unexpectedly during a campaign in China, and everything changed. Kublai and Hulagu, both powerful and ambitious, had tasted independence. They no longer wanted to just obey. They wanted to rule. Kublai declared himself the new great Khan, but other branches of the family didn't accept it. Civil war broke out. The dream of unity began to crack. Kublai Khan, however, would not be stopped. By 1271, he had founded the Yuan dynasty in China, officially becoming emperor. He moved the capital from Karakoram to what is now Beijing. He embraced Chinese customs, Confucian advisors, and court rituals. Too many Mongols, he seemed to be abandoning their identity, but Kublai believed adaptation was strength. He welcomed foreigners, like Marco Polo, into his court, and in many ways, he was right. Under his rule, China became a hub of trade, science, and culture. He printed paper money, sponsored massive public works, strengthened the Silk Road. He was a Mongol emperor of China and one of history's greatest hybrid rulers. But while Kublai ruled in splendor, the outer Khanates began to drift. The Ilkhanate in Persia became more Persian. The Golden Horde leaned toward Islam and Slavic alliances. The Chagatai Khanate fractured into eastern and western halves. Each Khanate followed its own path. The empire still existed, but only on maps. In spirit, it was no longer one. Even worse, the unity that made the Silk Road possible was fading. Borders hardened, tensions rose, trade slowed. The Mongol postal system, once lightning fast, lost funding. Corruption spread. Local rulers began to hoard power. By the early 1300s, the cracks were showing everywhere. And then came the plague. The Black Death didn't just kill millions. It shattered economies. It wiped out cities. It fueled rebellions. And it pushed the weakened empire further toward collapse. Kublai Khan died in 1294. His descendants struggled to hold on. By 1368, the Yuan dynasty was overthrown by native Chinese rebels. The Mongols retreated north, back into the steppes. One by one, the Khanates fell or were absorbed. By the 1400s, the once mighty Mongol Empire was gone, a comet that had lit the sky and then vanished, but its fragments remained. In Russia, the legacy of the Golden Horde would shape Muscovite politics and military models. In the Middle East, Mongol Persian art and science would influence empires for centuries. In China, the Yuan dynasty laid groundwork for future imperial rule and international trade. And in the memory of the world, the name Mongol still carried awe and fear. The empire after Genghis was vast, ambitious, and contradictory. It tried to be one thing across 100 cultures. It tried to balance conquest with governance. And for a brief moment, it succeeded. No one since, not the Romans, not the British, ever connected so much of the world, so fast. But what Genghis had built with fire and fear could not hold forever. Next in Chapter 9, we explore the untold stories, the overlooked heroes, spies, women, and scientists who kept the Mongol machine running behind the scenes. Chapter 9. Shadows of the Steppe. History often remembers warriors, but empires are not built by swords alone. Behind every charge, every conquest, and every stood others less seen, less praised, but just as vital. These were the shadows of the steppe. Start with the women. Mongol society was far more flexible than many of its time. Women could own property, manage herds, and even lead clans. And during Genghis Khan's campaigns, while the men rode to war, the women ruled the camps. One woman, Trejin Cotton, the widow of Gadai, ran the empire for 5 full years after his death. She issued decrees, managed diplomacy, and handpicked his successor. She wasn't a placeholder. She was the empire. Then there was Sorgatani Beki, wife of Tolui, and mother of 4 future Khans including Kublai and Mun. She was educated, multilingual, and deeply political. She ensured her sons received not just martial training, but lessons in Chinese administration, Islamic scholarship, and diplomacy. The empire didn't just grow from battles, it grew from the minds she shaped. Next, the intelligence networks. The Mongols didn't stumble across cities. They knew what was ahead long before arriving. They had a vast system of spies, informants, and scouts. Before invading Khwarezmia, Genghis had already mapped its cities, studied its defenses, and infiltrated its bureaucracy. Mongol spies dressed as merchants, monks, or what? They moved through caravans, markets, and temples. They didn't just collect maps. They collected minds. They understood local politics. They knew which generals were corrupt, which cities had grain shortages, which noble sons had rivalries. To the Mongols, knowledge was ammunition. Then came the engineers. Contrary to the image of wild horsemen, Mongols became masters of siege warfare. They hired the best. From Persia, they took stone-throwing engineers. From China, they brought catapult builders and gunpowder experts. From the Arab world, they learned waterworks and fortifications. When the Mongols approached a city, they built bridges, towers, siege ramps, and mines. They transported trebuchets across deserts. They turned rivers into moats or weapons. They rewrote the playbook on how to conquer civilization. They combined Chinese rockets with Islamic geometry. They didn't just break walls. And at the heart of it all was the YAM system, the Mongol postal and communication network. It was the circulatory system of the empire. Couriers could travel over 200 miles a day. Stations were placed every 25-30 miles across Asia. Each had fresh horses, supplies, and messengers. Orders from Karakoram could reach Baghdad in weeks, not months. A web of planners, accountants, horse breeders, cooks, stable masters, and watchmen. It wasn't just for war, it was for trade. Merchants, scholars, and voisals used the YAM, and to keep it working, the empire moved fast, because they moved together. Finally, the translators, scribes, and diplomats. In an empire that spanned a dozen religions and hundreds of languages, communication was survival. The Mongols employed entire bureaus of each letter the Khan sent might be copied in Mongolian, Chinese, Persian, Arabic, and Latin. They negotiated with popes and caliphs. They wrote treaties, tracked tributes, and managed local customs. Many were not Mongol by blood, but they served the empire with ink and intellect. Together, these shadows made the empire breathe. They didn't wear armor. Without them, the empire would have been no more than smoke. But they held the map, the pen, the coin, the key. While warriors burned cities, these unseen hands rebuilt roads, fed armies, and told stories. But without them, Genghis's dream would have collapsed before it began. And yet, most go unnamed. Their monuments are footnotes, their legacies whispered. It's easy to forget shadows, but it is in the shadows that great powers often hide their strength. In Chapter 10, we arrive at the final reflection. How did the world change after the Mongols? What legacies still echo today? Chapter 10. The world they left behind when the Mongol Empire began. The world was fragmented. Civilizations were isolated. Trade was slow. Ideas traveled on foot, if they traveled at all. But when the Mongols rose, everything changed. They didn't just conquer, they connected. And the world we live in today still echoes with the roads they opened, the systems they built, and the fear they once inspired. Let's begin with the most physical legacy, the Silk Road reborn. Before the Mongols, the Silk Road was dangerous and unreliable. Merchants had to cross dozens of borders, pay endless tolls, and risk being robbed by bandits or warlords. But under Mongol rule, the Silk Road became a soup. From China to Persia, all the way to Europe, one empire controlled the land. Passports scowled, Pasalé travelers moved freely, laws were enforced, bandits were punished, trade flourished, silks, spices, porcelain, and tea flowed west, glass, wine, textiles, and silver moved east. But more than goods, ideas moved to gunpowder, printing, paper money, Persian astronomy, Islamic medicine, Buddhist art. Even the Black Death traveled this route, unleashing tragedy, but also transformation. The Mongol world was a world in motion, and from that motion, modernity began. Then, look at governance. The Mongols didn't just impose their will, they borrowed, adapted, and streamlined. They used Chinese bureaucratic models, Persian tax systems, Islamic finance, and Turkic military structure. They created a merit-based system in many regions. They promoted talent regardless of race, religion, or origin. This inspired future the idea of blending military power with multicultural administration. It started here. They were brutal, yes, but also surprisingly pragmatic. Their postal network, Siam, was the prototype of modern logistics. Think about it. Relay stations, scheduled couriers, standardized supply points, today's global shipping, express mail, even military logistic systems. Oh, something to that Mongol blueprint. And then there's diplomacy. Before the Mongols, most kings saw foreigners as enemies, but the Khans saw the value of exchange. They sent envoys to the Pope, to the Franks, to the They married across cultures. They used translators as diplomats, not just tools. This set a precedent for international diplomacy, not based on trust but on function. Talk to survive, talk to trade, talk to rule. Even after their empire broke apart, the pieces they left behind still mattered. In China, the Yuan dynasty paved the way for future unification. In Russia, Mongol dominance shifted the center of power toward Moscow. In Persia, Mongol patrons supported art, science, and architecture. And in Europe, fear of the Mongols sparked new curiosity. It pushed people to ask, what else is out there? That curiosity would later fuel the age of exploration. Columbus carried letters meant for the Mongol court, thinking he'd find them in Asia. The ripple never stopped, but perhaps the most powerful legacy isn't physical. It's the proof they left behind. Proof that an empire could stretch across deserts, jungles, mountains, and ocean sands still work. Proof that fear and tolerance could coexist in one system. Proof that culture is stronger when it moves, blends, and adapts. We think of the Mongols as destroyers, and yes, they burned cities, shattered armies, erased kingdoms. But from that destruction, something unexpected emerged. A connected world. Their empire is gone. Their capital, Karakoram, lies in ruins. Even their bloodlines have scattered. But every time a package crosses a border, every time a translator builds a bridge, every time we trade, travel, or learn from afar, we walk the paths they opened. So next time you hear the word Mongol, don't just think of arrows and horses. Think of a world that became smaller best. They forced it to meet. That was their gift. And their warning. Empires rise. Empires fall. But the roots they carve through history sometimes last forever. If you made it this far into the story, thank you. If this journey through time opened your eyes, consider giving the video a like, leaving your thoughts in the comments, and subscribing for more quiet tales from history's hidden corners. After all, some of the deepest truths ride not on the battlefield, but in the stories we almost forgot.